Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar, Extended Enterprise Learning, Building Capability and Driving Performance Across the Value Chain. Our presenters today are Patrick Devlin, Chief Business Development Officer for Meridian Knowledge Solutions, and David Wentworth, Principal Learning Analyst for Brandon Hall Group. I would like to extend a thank you to Meridian Knowledge Solutions for sponsoring today's webinar. A little bit about Meridian. Meridian is used by leading organizations such as Department of Homeland Security, Johnson Controls, NASWA, the Society of Actuaries, and Kodak Alaris. For those of you that aren't familiar with Brandon Hall Group, we're a research and analyst firm that empowers excellence in organizations around the world through our research and tools. And also a quick mention that our Excellence Awards Spring program is now open for submissions. We have added about a dozen categories across all of the program areas, so be sure to visit our website for the latest. Your participation in our surveys is one of the most crucial components for our research. So if you do have a few minutes to spare throughout your week and you see any topics that you'd like to take a survey for, it's greatly appreciated. All participants receive a piece of complimentary research once the results are analyzed, and you can find these surveys at www.brandonhall.com. And finally, just a few logistics. The presentation is being recorded. The playback and slides will be provided to everyone within 24 hours of the webinar in a follow-up email. If you would like to ask the presenters a question, please do so by typing it into the question box on your control panel. And finally, if you would like to download a copy of the presentation right now, there is a handout section on your control panel where you may find the PDF and download it. So without further delay, I will turn it over to David.
Great, thanks, Melissa. I appreciate that. And actually, let me go back and just get yourselves familiar with that question box. That's the best way to get in touch with us. We've had a couple folks say that there's an audio issue, so maybe Melissa, you could respond to those folks about maybe they're experiencing. So, without further ado, as Melissa said, let's go ahead and start talking about this. So Patrick and I are going to try to dissect for you a little bit about the extended enterprise. And you know, it's a term that's used to cover a lot of different areas, and so it becomes quite complex simply because it applies to a bunch of different external learning audiences, but it also applies and has implications for multiple parts of the business as well. And that's one of the reasons that we've got Patrick with us today, because he has a very good understanding and knowledge of the ins and outs of how organizations try to deal with this. So we're going to use you know, our research and insights here at Brandon Hall Group, as well as Patrick's experience and knowledge to sort of talk through some of these things and how organizations can approach the extended enterprise and what benefits they can get by doing it the right way. So the first thing to do is we're going to take a dive into some of the research that we did at the end of last year around the extended enterprise and get a sense for where organizations are, what they're thinking about when they're exploring these external learning audiences. So what are some of those audiences? The biggest group that organizations in our study were reaching out to from a learning perspective were contract and contingent workers. And we do know that the gig economy has really exploded over the last few years. And so there's a lot of different types of contingent workers out there that need some sort of training or education. You've also got customers, which is the next biggest group. Many organizations deliver training to their customers for various reasons, whether it's for support, for product training, what have you. That's a big piece of this ecosystem. Then you've got other things. You have the entire value chain, right? There's distributors, resellers, franchisees, people that either sell or represent your products, or the people that provide you with materials to create or other parts up the value chain. It's important to be able to communicate and deliver knowledge and training in all of these different directions to all of these groups to make sure that your organization has its best foot out there, has the best representation within its customers, within its reseller networks, and so forth. So you can see that there's quite a lot of disparate audiences that could be at play here for any organization's extended enterprise. Some are only focused on one, maybe say customers. Others are reaching out to multiple audiences. And Patrick, I think it's a good time if I just bring you in just so you can say hi and introduce yourself and I was going to say, you know, in your experience, do you see your organizations often grappling with multiple audiences like this within one organization?
Thanks, David. Absolutely, we do. And you know what, whether it's people who are selling the products and services, servicing them, or using them as customers, all of those different audiences are ones that are traditionally being served by extended enterprise solutions. And then, of course, when you come into we mentioned association members here, but also just in a broader sense, anybody that's in the adult continuing education space that has to provide continuing education credits to their membership in any form are also, I think those four would round out the most common things we're looking at.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that there's commonality amongst each of these groups within themselves, or you mentioned, like, say, association members or continuing education. You've got groups of professionals that don't necessarily work for the same company, but they have the same career, the same interests, what have you. But I think the common thread through all of this, and that's what we're after here, is obviously talking about the extended enterprise audiences of learners that you may be trying to reach that don't necessarily work for your organization. They are not internal employees. So that creates a whole layer of challenges that we'll dig into. But wanted to share with you from our research what we've seen, what organizations are after when they develop an extended enterprise learning strategy. And this can apply to any or all or some of those groups that we just listed out as far as the outcomes. But these are the things that companies say that they are getting out of having an extended enterprise strategy. So it helps increase the awareness of the products and services, whether that's to consumers or it could be to sales professionals as well, or franchisees, what have you. It improves those customer relations. And so you can see a lot of these different things: reducing cost, actually helping increase sales, generating revenue. There's a lot of elements involved and a lot of benefits to be reaped from a proper extended enterprise learning strategy. And we'll dig into a couple of these benefits here, and we'll talk about them. So there's the idea that you can gain market share. So the idea is that when you have these different sales channels, these different partners where these salespeople don't necessarily work for your organization, and they might be representing multiple brands, multiple different companies, and they're selling them within, say, a dealership environment or some other reseller environment. What we found is that salespeople who are quite knowledgeable about certain products or services are more likely to sell those products or services, right? They're able to answer the questions the consumers might have. They're able to do a better job of selling those products because they have a better understanding of what they are. So being able to provide world-class, top-notch training to these resellers is critical because that's going to arm them to best represent your brand out there. We talked a little bit about the different levels of the supply chain, right? Distributors, even manufacturers, people that are bringing things into your organization, as well as those reseller networks. By providing training and learning to these audiences and having that connection, it helps create a global presence. You're now active in those areas that you're communicating with those different entities within the value chain. And then, of course, greater exposure for all the products and services. It's just having some sort of externally facing strategy for how you talk about your products and services helps with that exposure and gaining market share. Then, of course, you can help drive innovation and deliver new products and services because it helps you collaborate with those suppliers and manufacturers as you work to streamline that process. Obviously, better connection to customers. I mean, this has been going on for a while, but we know that we live in an era of a very well or super informed consumers. Sometimes it's well informed, sometimes they have a lot of information that doesn't apply. But in either case, they have a lot of information at the ready, and your reseller partner networks need to be able to manage that. So being able to deliver training to those customers as well to make sure they have the best information. And then, of course, new opportunities to upsell. So if you're training your customers and you're giving them a good experience about your products and services, it's also an opportunity to expand that relationship as well.
And David, if I could just comment
absolutely.
on the first bullet there too, I think there's a notion that a lot of the internal training that's being delivered is required training, and and that required training is not such a big part of extended enterprise learning. But in our experience, especially when you talk about collaborations with suppliers and manufacturers and the people that service and support your products in a distribution channel situation, a lot of that training is not only required, but there's very real sort of professional and revenue implications associated with it. So the importance of the training is magnified because of that. So it can be revenue generating, but also required on the behalf of the people that are receiving it. So the importance of it being available, it being intuitive to access, and of course, whenever you're dealing with required training, that means people always put it off to the last possible moment when it's required. So you have to be, those critical moments in time during the year are just as important in this environment as any other.
Right, and I think by bringing that up too, you've also sort of started to unravel the thread that goes through all this, is that there's a very strong possibility that in any given organization, the learning function has no insight into that relationship that you just described, right? Sometimes those relationships are happening and that communication is happening outside of learning completely. And so that's sort of part of what we want to do in this webinar, is sort of open everyone's eyes to the ramifications of this and how everyone needs to sort of work together, because, it might make sense that a certain group within the business owns that relationship with the suppliers and the manufacturers, but there can be some collaboration, whether it's from a technology standpoint or a training creation or delivery standpoint, to help build those relationships. So you'll see that as we go through, and we'll dig into it a little bit deeper about, as I mentioned at the beginning, the complexities internally about who owns this and how we deliver on it. And so then, the last bit on the that customer experience, obviously there's a strong relationship after the sale, right? It isn't just you've bought the product and then the window shuts and we never speak again. It's, stretching out that customer relationship, making sure that you stay connected. Again, I mentioned earlier, staying ahead of the informed consumer. And a big one is that less reliance on customer support. If the clients are better trained and they have a better understanding of the products and services and how to use them, they're far less likely to be calling up your support desk or creating support tickets, which is a huge cost saver. And not only does it help with that customer satisfaction, but can really reduce costs from a support standpoint if you're addressing those issues up front through training. So there's a lot of opportunity there when we talk about extended enterprise training. So getting into a little bit of that, ownership piece, and this is going to lead us into some of the bigger challenges. Just looking at our research around what are companies spending, and this is focused purely on L&D functions, right? The L&D function and that budget, the L&D budget. How much of that is allocated to extended enterprise training, whatever that may entail for that particular organization, whether it's just customers or if it's customers and resellers and other partner networks. And it's all over the map, as you can see. But 57% spend less than spend less than 10% of the L&D budget on extended enterprise training. But then you've got 22% of the organizations we talk to spend more than 25% of the L&D budget on customer training. But Patrick, I think this is where we again start to get into the kernels of where the big challenges are for extended enterprise training. Is learning doesn't always own any or all of the extended enterprise budget, right?
Absolutely. You definitely see a lot more cross-functional ownership and collaboration and participation in the delivery of these types of solution, with especially from marketing and design and branding and things of that nature. Because when you do start presenting these things to external audiences, especially clients, partners, distributors, resellers, those sorts of things, I think there's a much broader heightened awareness of how important those things can be, and a desire to really take a greater depth of control over the overall user experience. And so they're definitely different projects with different priorities.
Yeah, and so that opens us up to some of the other challenges that we wanted to talk through. And so as we're on this thread, Patrick, about the ownership and governance, can you touch a little bit more on some of this about, who owns this, who can own it, what it might look like in any given organization?
Well, I think as you properly represent in this slide, it can be many different. I don't think there's ever one answer to this, but I think the difference is that these other organizations like marketing, sales, and operations are absolutely much more involved, if not completely owning these activities in 100% independent from what might be going on with the HRIS or the LMS that's being integrated with the HRIS and run by HR. As I said, I think the biggest things that we run into are just a very, very heightened awareness around that UX and the ability to do a highly customized experience especially on the front end when you're sort of promoting and navigating people through the process of actually identifying the programs, selecting the programs, and the like, and then wanting to integrate that seamlessly into the delivery side. So there's a lot more customization and branding and design work that we see done on the front end on that whole user experience.
Right, absolutely, and we'll dig some more into the technology piece as we go through, and we'll see, some more of the research and share some of Patrick's insight on technologies. But when we just laid out what organizations say are their challenges, their biggest challenges when it comes to the extended enterprise, here are the responses we got. So you got 58% of organizations say it's really difficult to measure the effectiveness of our efforts when it comes to extended enterprise learning, and you can understand why. Organizations are chronically challenged by measuring their own internal learning, right, for their own employees. So now you take one step removed from that and you start to look at external audiences that don't work for the company, and try to figure out how are we measuring the effectiveness of our training when we have, and again, this is on here too, 28%, there's a little insight into what those people are doing after the fact, how much of an impact that learning is having on them. There are those customer metrics that you can use, like customer satisfaction, less reliance on support. But in other environments, sometimes it can be difficult to measure the effectiveness. Another one is content development. How are we creating or sourcing the content that we're going to put in there? And we'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. And this will also come up as, Patrick was talking a moment ago about the different types of technology. There could be many different technologies at play, but 38% of companies feel like they don't have the right technology to do this from any standpoint. And then you can see some of the others. And I think also that intellectual property one comes up, which is something that doesn't often get thought of, obviously, from an internal learning perspective. But when we start to reach out to external audiences, it does become important to make sure that the intellectual property that's involved in some of this training is managed properly and secure. So going back to the content piece.
And if I were to put my try to see the perspective of the people that were saying the lack of technology, some of I think some of what we see behind that would relate to the ability to integrate with similar to an HR LMS solution, integration to other programs and products and technologies within their ecosystem is very important, and they're going to be different than the ones you would traditionally run into in an internal learning ecosystem. And then there's also things like how are you going to authenticate users that aren't part of your solution? And many times you'll need multiple different authentication capabilities on the front end. And then, of course, I think everybody has to deal with unique reporting requirements, no matter what the solution might be addressing. But those seem to even be more complex when you're dealing with extended enterprise solutions.
Yeah, precisely. It's like you could take almost any challenge that a company comes across from an internal learning standpoint, permissions, reporting, any of those, and then just, extrapolate that out when you start to deal with the extended enterprise, which is why it becomes such a technology issue and a reliance on having the right technologies in place to address those things. You can see here, just digging in a little bit on the content, that it adds another layer of complexity, because you can have situations where the content that's being provided from a training standpoint is either completely different from what's being delivered internally, and that's like 38% of companies say that, or it could be all of it's available to both groups. You see 24% say whatever we deliver externally is also available internally. So we're delivering the same thing to both of those groups. And then you've got in the middle that crossover. External audiences get some of the stuff we do internally, some of the stuff we deliver is exclusive, and that gets right into some of the things Patrick's talking about permissions. Who gets to see what, how do we manage that process, and do we have the right technologies and governance in place to manage that as well? We don't need to spend a ton of time, but just again, adding the layers of complexity, the different types of content types that are available to the extended enterprise. This is what companies say is the makeup of that external content. So, ILT, videos, webinars, e-learning courses, down to games and micro-learning. So there's just as much as you would see internally, we see a wide variety of learning opportunities being delivered externally too. So again, trying to manage that through the proper technology platform and making sure that the right audiences are getting the right experiences for the outcomes that you are after. And I think when we talk about outcomes, this is one of the big ones, is that, you know, we saw earlier the big challenge for companies was their inability to really measure the effectiveness. So we asked them, well, how are you doing it? What are you using to measure the effectiveness? And it's course completions for the most part, learner feedback, assessments, which a lot of these are somewhat similar, but depending on the organization and sort of the philosophy that's ascribed to, things like testing and assessments and questionnaires can be different, but all falling into sort of the same kind of category of we're just sort of asking the learners questions for feedback on whether or not, you know, they liked the material, whether or not they feel like it applies, whether or not you know, they got something out of it. You can see here 15% say they actually don't measure the effectiveness of the extended enterprise training that they do. So Patrick, I was going to ask you, you know, in your experience as you work with organizations who are doing this, you know, does this jive with what you see when you talk with them, or are there other things that companies are facing when it comes to a measurement perspective on this stuff?
Well, you know, it does, but I think because we're using the same language that we typically use in internal learning programs, sometimes the nuances that aren't appreciated in when you look at these. But one of the things I was surprised not to see here is revenue, because many of the clients, in fact, I would say 80% of the clients that are using us for extended enterprise solutions, revenue is a key metric to the programs that they're trying to do. Metrics, and then I mean revenue metrics, as well as in the case of like dealers and distributors and things, it's trying to get a certain percentage of those who are participating in these programs up to a certain level of certification. So there are a lot of goals around that, and those goals can even drive reimbursement revenue for the learners and the organizations that the learners are a part of. In the case of saying somebody maybe is in a heavy manufacturing thing, like a forklift company that has their service people are being done by external their services are being done by external companies. Their warranty, the fee that they make for doing warranty repairs is driven by their accreditation level in the system. And so, as you can imagine, if it's coming down to the deadline and there's significant revenue associated with that, the importance of getting these, having the availability, the accessibility, the usability, and all of those things becomes much more heightened. So this does have a tendency to look very similar, maybe, to a lot of other programs that you would run internally. But I do think in the end, the motivation, the drive, and the level of effectiveness is measured very differently in most extended enterprise solutions.
Yeah, I think that's true. And, you know, we actually got a great question from Melody on this, and maybe you can shed some insight here, because Melody's asking, so what is the rate of, you know, measurement across these extended audiences? You know, it's hard to do internally for surveys, but so the question from Melody is like, what percent actually participate in these programs? You know, what's good? Because I think internally there's a threshold of, you know, okay, we put this program together and we need to have 95% completion, you know, to feel like we've been successful. Do you feel like that's different for external audiences? Is that something that companies are worried about completion because they don't, you know, have ownership of these employees per se?
I think it's very similar that those goals exist. I think it's what's where there's variability is what those goals will be in terms of the level of compliance. And as I said, in the case where those levels of compliance have revenue impact for both the people delivering the learning as well as the people receiving it, then those become extraordinarily important. But if you're talking about more like client-facing things where it's not mandatory for them to do it, but you're trying to encourage it, once again, I do think things like a percentage of the clients that are engaging in these things and measuring your account-based reach from a marketing perspective are extremely important metrics. So I think she's spot on in that regard.
All right, great. So you had started talking a little bit about accreditation, so let's dig into that a little bit more. From our research, you know, we asked one of the things, you know, going back to the goals of extended enterprise training, we're showing here that 53% of companies say that they're after, you know, compliance. They're trying to stay in compliance with their various, you know, external agencies. Then there's the need for certification or recertification. We see that a lot in associations or other continuing education environments. And then, risk management, that can roll up into compliance training as well. So, Patrick, I know that this is something you know very well, not only from internal learning, but external as well, managing the different accreditations and certifications. So what are some of the ins and outs here?
Well, that recertification is a very interesting thing. For example, we're working right now with a firm that delivers high-end imaging and scanners that are used at a lot of border crossings and the like, whether it's in airports or big ones that trucks are scanning through at borders. And they do a very good job when they deliver these very expensive solutions of delivering the training up front. So they get people up to speed on how to use this equipment when it's purchased. And as part of that, that's normally very hands-on and done in person. But then it's that retraining that is required either because of turnover or just the need or things have changed, those sorts of things. The machines have been upgraded, et cetera, that they struggle with. And I think their challenge is very common. And so while they might be able to do that first purchase, they might be able to afford and have the resources to support the in-person training on site. They don't have that to go back to every client on a regular basis and do the recertification. And that's where they're looking for technology to play a much bigger role. And I think, you talk about risk management. If you're looking at that particular application, the risk associated with errors is very high. And so I think that recertification and risk management sometimes can be very interconnected.
Yeah, 100%. So, it's important as you're thinking about this strategy, if there is a certification or a compliance element to what you're doing, then it's important to be able to have a system or a platform that allows you to track the entire certification history, so who is at what status and when they need to maybe recertify or re-go through compliance. And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier a little bit with the intellectual property. It doesn't necessarily have to be IP, but that ability to make sure that learners are interacting with the content that they need to see and not anything else. They don't have to go wading through stuff that's either irrelevant or stuff that they shouldn't even have access to in order to get what they want. And then having those different learning paths. So like as you go through these levels of certification and compliance, that as people hit these certain levels or these different milestones, they're able to move forward in a way that makes sense for them, instead of having to, sort of find their own way. It's delivered in a pre-thought out way, so that everyone can make it through that path in the time that they're supposed to, however that's supposed to work, as opposed to just sort of an one size fits all. Let's throw it all out there. This is a smaller slice of a bigger thing that we'll talk about as well. Is when you're dealing with the extended enterprise and delivering training or learning experience, what have you, it's one thing to have different groups internally that need their own experiences, but now you're talking about this wide variety of disparate groups who need to have very specific experiences within these platforms. And so you need something that's able to do that can actually provide those very unique experiences that are tailored to that group, whether it's customers, whether it's a series of franchisees, or people in a continuing education environment that need to get these certifications. And in many cases, as we said, that those three examples are happening at the same time within a given organization. So the ability to do that in a coherent way is very important.
And it's also important to note that sometimes we're actually certifying the entire organization. So in order for it's not just at an individual level. So in many cases, you're certifying this dealership as having, a minimum of 70% of their staff at this level of certification qualifies the entire dealership, for certain rights and privileges and advantages. So it's not just at an individual level as it is often in a in an internal corporate environment.
Mm-hmm. So to only add to the complexity, or at least from Patrick and I's perspective, help demystify it a little bit, we're going to dig into another element of the extended enterprise, which is e-commerce. Patrick, you mentioned companies using revenue as a measurement of their extended enterprise learning, and that can take on two meanings, right? It can be the revenue that the organization is generating based on sales from resellers or franchisees or what have you, but it can also be straight revenue from the programs as the training is being charged for. And I think I found in my experience when I talk to companies and we start talking about the extended enterprise, some aren't even aware that this is, you know, a possibility or an opportunity that organizations are charging for the training that they've created. And so we asked in our study, are you charging for extended enterprise learning? And you can see here, it's nearly half, about 46% of companies say, yes, we're charging at least some of the audiences, if not all of the audiences that we deliver to for this training. And so the question then becomes, okay, well, which audiences are being charged? The biggest group that gets it charged for this would be customers. And we're going to explain some of this and talk through some of the ins and outs of it. We're just sharing the data at the moment, but other groups, contract contingent workers, are being charged for the learning, and then you can see on down the line. And the way that companies charge can take a lot of different shapes and or sizes. And first, it starts with, you know, what's the process for that occurring? And you can see 36% of companies have an e-commerce tool that is integrated into the platform that they're using to deliver the training, right? So it's all happening within the same piece of software. You got another 25% say that, well, we've got our own standalone e-commerce tool that can serve not only that platform, but maybe several others. And there's, you know, there's a separation integration going on there. And then there's 39% say that they don't actually use an e-commerce tool. And that's in those situations where you'll see the training being bundled as part of the product purchase, right? So it's being charged for, it's being accounted for as part of the purchase of the product, but there's no need for an actual e-commerce event to take place to do that. So as I get into this last one, I would show that, you know, the different types of ways that companies can charge for extended enterprise learning, whether it's, you know, you pay a subscription, you have access to a specific catalog, or you're buying it sort of an a la carte, right? That's the biggest group, 47% say they offer it as, I can buy this or that piece that I want. 21% bundle things together into you know, smaller than a subscription, but bigger than a la carte. And then, as I mentioned before, you got 19% say that it's included in the product pricing. So, you know, Patrick, just given your experience with the revenue side and people delivering in all these different environments, you know, what are some of the other, or some of the ins and outs of the complexities of how you can bill for this type of training, or how this type of training can generate revenue?
Well, I think it's there's another dimension to this. You talked about subscriptions, and within subscriptions and bundles, there can be a lot of complexity as well. But I also think there's another level, and that is the notion that sometimes you're doing this direct to consumers, like in the case of an adult education program for CEUs, for physicians. Many times that would just be a physician coming in and doing a B2C type of transaction. However, there are many other situations where that physician may be part of a larger practice, and the practice may want, as a part of being a member of that practice, then they may want to acquire this at a corporate level, and then make that available to the people that are in their practice for free. And so you have to be able to take into those sort of B2B opportunities with even though the audience and the content might be identical, you might have to provide both of those. And then there's the third category where, you know, I don't really have a fancy term for this, but where you might be actually reselling this through an intermediary as a bundle, and they may in fact then be providing it out either to B2C or B2B on the other end. And a couple of our clients are doing all of that. And so trying to manage all of that within a solution that really wasn't designed around those capabilities, and we see that all the time. People come to us and they're trying to they've either built their own solution, or they're trying to make it work on whatever solution the HR team selected for internal training without even considering these use cases, and both can be very, very painful. So there's e-commerce and the levels of complexity associated with it are something you generally just don't see internally.
Right, and you know, depending on how this is owned and governed within the organization, you know, in our research, we've talked to companies that can, you know, say that they're being able to defray some of the learning technology cost, right? The cost of the platform that they use to deliver learning is actually deferred by the charging for training. So there's it's this process of trying to turn learning from a cost center into a revenue generator, and actually recognize some revenue from learning technologies. So you actually mentioned a bit and started talking a lot about technology. So let's dive into that. And I think this is a key piece to all of this, right? Is what kind of technologies are companies leveraging for this? And so we asked, and 62% of companies in our study say they use a learning management system, which would be a proprietary purchased market available learning management system. Another 35% use a website that the learners come into to access the materials. Social collaboration platforms are in play. We have here circled this in-house learning system. So that would be something that organizations have built on their own to solve this issue. And Patrick and I have discussed this a little bit, and we'll talk about it now. It's the idea that we see this very often when we look at, I look at things from a purely L&D standpoint. When challenges come up, organizations tend to look at whatever technology they already have available to them. What do we have in-house? And can we repurpose that to meet this need? And this is one of those areas where I think you can see here, 28% of companies have decided this is something we can build. But it's been our experience with Brandon Hall as we walk hundreds of companies through technology selections. One of the things that happens the most is at the beginning of that technology selection process, they tell us the story of how they tried to build something on their own, and it ended up requiring so many workarounds, customizations, and integrations that it's barely sustainable at all. And now they're looking for a proprietary solution, and they've spent a lot of time and money on this internal system that they've tried to build. And I think, like I said, Patrick, you and I have had this conversation, but that's your experience as well. You tend to talk to a lot of organizations who have tried to cobble together other existing platforms to try to solve a pretty specific problem.
We certainly see it a lot more often today in extended enterprise solution delivery than we do in in-house or internal solutions. And I think some of it is actually, it's easy to discard, in-house, but building these things yourself out of hand. But some of them, I think, are driven by pretty strong logic. I think they look at what, for example, we had one client that was looking at us and saying, we've looked at the existing off-the-shelf solutions, but they do 1,001 things. We need 4. And we need those 4 things to be optimized to our particular need. And I think where that, and so I think they start off on the right footing. And in many cases, some of them that might be enough, especially ones that have a lot of web design and web development capabilities internally that these constituents or consumers are already interacting with on web portal properties, those sorts of things where they're trying to engage. And this is seen as an extension of that. But then when it comes down to as these things tend to grow, that requirements list, I call it elegance creep. The needs continue to grow, and at some point, the people that built the original ones, we all know the story, aren't there. They want 3 new things, and they want to change the 4 things they've already done, and that's when I think they end up coming back out and reconsidering those choices.
Yeah. No, absolutely, and I think you're 100% right that those types of solutions are often grounded in the best of intentions, and it's not until you get pretty far down the road that companies realize that it's not meeting the needs for sure. But one thing we found in our research was that this is an area where technology has a huge impact on whether the strategy works or not. You can see here 3/4 of companies say that technology has a huge impact on whether or not their extended enterprise learning is effective. So it's really important to think this through and try to get it right. And we then asked, organizations, what are you thinking about from a technology standpoint when you think of the extended enterprise? What requirements do you have of a technology solution? So, back to what you're saying, Patrick, they think they only need, these 4 things. Here are the list of things that companies feel like they do need specifically. And so reporting and analytics, not really surprising that that's high on the list, given that companies already say they have a hard time measuring this. They want tools that make it easier. but we see this for internal learning as well. I think it's interesting to see how high mobile capabilities are on here. Again, something that's also on the list for internal learning, but maybe not as high. And I think this has to do with the fact that organizations cannot be certain of their external learning audiences and how and when and where they're going to participate in the learning, right? So the ability to provide it in multiple formats and making it mobile ready so that people can access it when and where they would like to is actually a pretty important piece of this. You know, the testing assessment tool, that goes back to the reporting, being able to keep track of things. Data security becomes a huge issue because you're talking about you know, externally facing audiences. So making sure all your data is secure is important. You see the others. Social platform. I think, to me, this next one should be higher on the list. I think it's because organizations might not have thought this through yet, and so or haven't experienced the issue as of yet. But the ability to set up multiple portals or domains for different learners, we touched on it a little bit. But Patrick, talk about that a little bit. The how important this piece is, the multiple portals and domains.
Sorry, I was muted there.
Okay.
It is very important, and you know, the especially in situations where I'll go back to you know, we run into this internally as well, where people want to brand and wall off and create different user experiences and make different content available or what have you in an internal environment. But the significance of maybe your, you know, one of your internal departments maybe getting access to information or content or materials from another part of your organization is much less dramatic than if, say, you have two competitive dealers. I go back to the dealership example just to stay consistent. So you might have two dealer or, you know, big auto dealer organizations that are actually competitors. And you know, so you might be providing information and having them share the same learning environment. And in many cases, because of those relationships are so deep and wide, they're even administering their own learning environments that deliver this training from the manufacturer onto the external learning communities. And so those administrators, it's so important that they be permissioned and managed in such a way so that there's never a mixing of multiple organizations that you're supporting. And when we talk about this, I mean, we have had experience where we've had as many as we're not just talking a handful of different domains that need to be managed. In some cases, we have as many as 200, 300 different domains that are being managed within one instance, and with remote administration. So there are administrators in each one of those domains that are not your employees that are also have administrative access to the tool. And so the complexity there, I think virtually any you know, sort of robust LMS provider out there in the market today will say, oh, we support, they might not all call them domains, they might call them organizational units, they might call them something else, but it's easy for them to say, oh yes, we do that. But then in reality, when you start looking at the use cases and the workflows associated with it and what is required to make all that work, they're not robust enough to support some of these implementations. And I think that's grossly underestimated, either doing when they're evaluating third-party providers like ourselves and our competitors, or when they're looking at building it themselves.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it blows me away when you say hundreds of you know, domains, because I think a lot of times when people think about this, they're maybe thinking a handful, right? That's what they're thinking is they're going to be dealing with. But there, like you said, a lot of different scenarios where hundreds of different domains needed. And then I think the other key element is you mentioned those external administrators. And so being able to provide somebody external with the rights and permissions to do the things they need to do to administer that, and then being able to set what those are. And they might not be the same across the board, right? You might have different levels of permissions and roles, and being able to manage that, again, becomes that much more complex when you're dealing with external entities, and being able to make sure that, you know, in order to be an administrator, you're able to do a certain amount of things, but there's certain things that you can't, and then having other permissions for other administrators. So it can get very complex very quickly. Oh, you know what? I wanted to ask one question as I go back to this real quick. The question that came in from the group was asked, what are like the common initial things when a company is just starting out? Here we go on this one. What are the common initial things when someone's just starting out? Like what should companies be thinking of? Is it things that are on this list? Is there something that maybe isn't on this list? What would you say, just offhand, are the key things you should think of first, Patrick?
Well, I think I based upon what we just discussed, I think you absolutely have to take into consideration the level of complexity associated with managing multiple users with different domains, user communities in different domains. I think that's enormously complex. And then we've already talked about the e-commerce functionality, because they're not as integral to maybe some of the other programs you're working on. You might not give that as much consideration up front, and ultimately they can be deal breakers on the back end. But I also think that the biggest, another big thing is that you are going to be dealing with different organizational stakeholders in these circumstances, and so being sure, even more sure than normal, that you're including them in the process, and that you have a governance structure that's in place to manage all that over time, I think is very important. I also think that while I don't mean this to sound pejorative. If it does, I apologize. But a lot of times people give the user experience a bit of lip service on when you're actually delivering required compliance training internally. User experience or not, people are going to consume that content.
Right.
That user experience, when those external learners are actually customers and resellers and service providers, and you have business, and they're part of your sort of business ecosystem, that user experience just becomes vitally critical. And it's almost every one of those interactions is a branding interaction from a sales and marketing perspective, and even to the point where we have some clients that one of the things they really appreciate about our solution is that we have such an extensive set of APIs, and that every course and every place within our application can be deeply linked to. And so some people integrate a lot of the upfront work of actually promoting and engaging and discovery of what's available. They customize all of that, and then the only time they get to our LMS is when they actually click to launch and deliver, and they need the delivery of the content, and then that content can be delivered immediately into their window, and they're not even navigating at all through the LMS. So they consume the content. They don't even realize perhaps that the content is being delivered by the LMS, and all the tracking and all the organization that went in to get it to there, and then they move on. So I use the term headless when you and I were talking about this some, but that level of customizing the workflows and managing the user experience and integrating that user experience into the other things you're doing with these consumers on your other web properties is critical.
Yeah, and that just really highlights how much of a collaborative effort this needs to be for a lot of organizations. So, and there are some where learning handles the whole process because they've got the technology, whether it's the LMS, and they own the content creation, but they're not seeing sort of the big picture like you're describing, where this experience has to be really customer driven, and then being able to create that kind of experience, and then all of the other sort of administrative ins and outs that matter, that need other parts of the organization to be involved. And you can see here from a technology standpoint, and we've touched on some of this, but within your organization, to get this right, depending on the audiences you're reaching, there's a wider variety of integrations that are probably going to go on beyond a typical talent-facing HRIS technology solution like an LMS, where you might integrate it with a performance management system and an HRIS system, things everyone's already familiar with. This is going to require some IT know-how and some understanding of what are all the touch points, where are we touching these audiences, these customers, these resellers, how are we interacting with them, and how can we connect all these things together. So if you're using learning technology to do this, there might need to be integrations with marketing, with a CRM, with custom portals, e-commerce tools, all kinds of different things depending on how your organization operates. And I think you've touched on, a few of these, Patrick, but it really becomes critical to understand how these all work and who, for what purposes should what different groups take control or administrative control or governance for those interactions. And so I think you work with organizations that have any kind of combination of things that are in here for sure. And I think one of the things you had mentioned to me that was important in this is like being able to be secure e-commerce. So if there are going to be transactions that you're integrating with, the ability to handle whether it's discounts or different fees or different currencies, different taxes, that becomes critical. Something that isn't often front of mind for maybe learning professionals or HR professionals. So a lot of things at work, and I think your description there of the headless LMS is a great example because these are external groups. They don't care that their stuff is in an LMS or wherever it is. It's one thing to have internal learners and create a great experience, and they know that they're going to go through their training software platform to do it. The customers don't think of it like that, right? They're thinking of it as an interaction with the company. So it's a sales, marketing, relationship opportunity. So before we step into some of the different strategies that we had laid out, Patrick, anything you wanted to say about the integration?
I think we've covered most of this. I just think it is interesting to look at the different integration touch points that you are going to encounter and the different people that own these solutions and so just the governance processes that need to be navigated in order to pull all this together.
Yep. So when we talk about making it work, we can make it just a quick touch here on the research. It was interesting to me that 56% of companies said that their extended enterprise learning efforts are either effective or highly effective, which is actually pretty good compared to some of the effectiveness rates for internal learning. So this is an area where organizations realize we're looking outward to very important groups like customers and resellers, and so they try to put their best foot forward. Very important that they are effective. Let's talk again. I think we touched on the multiple domains.
David, some of that may just simply be too because it is so much more generically. Just generally speaking, it is so much. Generally, there are very clear business goals, and so the ease of measuring that effectiveness. So maybe some of the noise and confusion and the angst and the pain that goes along with any project is less. It's easier to sort of deal with that because there are a couple of 1, 2, 3 goals that have to be met, and if those are met, it's going to be deemed highly effective. Right. And so I think sometimes just having those clearly established business objectives in this sort of environment and goals can make the measurement, or at least the sense of this, feel more to the left than to the right. I think you're right.
And I think you could include that the groups are on the other end of that spectrum, where the only thing they've got in hand is whether or not those groups have finished the course or the element. And if it's a yes, then that's success.
Or as Elliot Mazie has said in the past, pounds of flesh trained.
I can't tell if that's better than butts and seats or not. So you had already touched on this a little bit, but again, we can't talk about how important multiple domains are for all these different things. The ability to create branding, those customized environments, so that the groups are getting a very contextual experience based on what their needs are. They're only seeing what they need to see, and it makes everything consistent. You can keep consistent brand across domains, and then a consistent feel for that particular group. The ability for those groups to then provide feedback. I think that feedback loop is critical, even more so than even internally, because you need that customer or reseller feedback to make sure things are moving in the right direction. And then we talked a bit about that distributed animation, the administration need, the ability for people who aren't employees to be able to administer these learning environments for these various groups as well is a critical piece. Let's see here. So the reporting and analytics piece, we saw that as one of the biggest things that companies want out of their technology. So it isn't just a technology issue. It's important to know what the key metrics are at the outset. You know, that Patrick was touching on that, being able to say, okay, we know that we want, you know, this to happen with the sales process, or we know that we want these products to sell this quickly or do that. Whatever those outcomes on the reason are, we're delivering this, or we want support tickets to drop. We don't, you know, we want less reliance on the support desk. Whatever those outcomes are, figure out what they are and set them. Are there any performance-based outcomes that we can measure? Anything beyond test scores or completion rates or thumbs up, thumbs down? Whatever those are, identify those. And then being able to combine this training data with other data, like if it's sales data or customer data, anything else, be able to really answer some actual questions, gain some actual insights is important. And then trying to find any, those external entity stakeholders, those people that are in those franchises, people that are in those companies that can help provide some of that information, because it's often difficult to get. We actually, I think, walked through this. I don't know, Patrick, I think you've even got some examples of companies you work with that have some pretty complex e-commerce needs. I don't know if you want to talk about what that looks like, or if you've already touched on that.
Yeah, I think you know, I touched on it earlier. You know, in terms of the B2B, the B2C, and then the bundling to a third-party intermediary, along with all the other things you had on that slide. But I didn't even get into the tax and currency issues that might be involved as well, and discounts and codes and you know and the like. So just a lot of things that you do not see, and many things you do not see in traditional learning applications, right, for sure.
Yeah, and it actually all comes back to that experience, right? You don't want to put your end users through some complex process for them to have to, you know, pay for things if they can't figure out how easily to do it. If your system can't easily translate different taxes and currencies or different payment options, very critical that that's a very smooth process. I don't know if anybody else on the line has ever had to buy something, whether it's training or not. You know, you really want that process to go very smoothly. Very important. So the last thing we'll have, and I'll just leave this here, and this is part of the deck. If you want to take, you know, if you want to download the PDF from the handout section in your control panel, a link to download it will also go out within the next day or so here, along with a link to the recording. But just, you know, some things to think about, considerations. You know, what's the business case around extended enterprise learning? What are we trying to do? Who are our audiences? What are the integration requirements? So you can see all these different steps, things to think about. It's just a good checklist as you're thinking these things through. You know, we had the question earlier about what are the things to consider at the beginning. I think this is a decent place to begin with these considerations. So with that, we've just got a couple minutes left. And we did manage to answer, I think, most of the questions that came in, Patrick, as they came in. But I'm going to toss up a real softball for you here. Sonia asked, what platforms do you recommend to serve multiple domains? And I know the answer to this, because I think, you know, what we're talking about is you know, Meridian Knowledge Solutions happens to do this very well.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we were fortunate enough to be involved in a build out for Motorola University some, I don't know, dozen or more years ago, in which they required some very complex multi-domain management and distributed administration and branding and all those things. And so we worked together with them and built that into the core of our application 15 plus years ago. And that has only matured and built and allowed us to leverage that capability to support more clients over the years. So yeah. I absolutely think we're in a great position to support people in this regard.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is we align the webinar topics with our sponsors. There's a reason why we're having Meridian and Patrick do this particular webinar, because they handle a lot of very complex, very sort of mission critical, compliance driven environments. And so that's why this topic fits so well for what they do and what Patrick talks about, which is why I was glad to have you with us today, Patrick, to answer these questions, because this can get very, very tricky. But with the right strategy and the ability to understand the different technology requirements. And I think, you know, the one thing that you kept stressing to me when we were talking about this is this isn't wholly an HR learning issue, right? It's clearly something that's part of other parts of the organization, and everyone needs to work together. It's not really a thing where learning says, well, this is learning, so we should own it and let's just take it, run with it. It involves a lot of different things. It involves customer facing parts of the business. It involves operations parts of the business, people who know what should be going on there. And so there's a delicate governance setup that needs to be put in place. So again, I thank you, Patrick, for coming in and sharing your insights today for sure.
Thank you, David.
Yep. So like I said, you can download the PDF of the deck in the handouts. I encourage you to do that, but a link will go out to everyone. I do believe we answered all the questions that had come in, so I appreciate that. And again, just tons of thanks to Meridian for giving us an hour of Patrick's time today to share with you all. And we hope to talk to you again and see you on another webinar. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your time. Really appreciate it.